further ado, let's get straight into it. Now definitely isn't the time for business as usual. Since we've all taken a bit of an interesting turn over the last 14 or so months, since COVID-19 really made its presence felt, it's been the perfect time to actually take stock and rethink the way in which we conduct business. Now is very much the time to rethink your business strategy, your product and your service offering, your markets and your marketing. This is the time that you need to be thinking about how you're going to diversify and grow. And the first part of that diversification really needs to be around your market selection. So today's session, we're going to cover off market selection. So just how do you select a market? We're going to look at doing your homework, which of course is where it all starts. We're going to revisit the 4 Ps in the context of market selection. We're going to look at market entry models in some detail, and we're also going to look at e-commerce and really just focusing on e-commerce very briefly. As I mentioned, there will be some fully fledged e-commerce webinars and workshops coming up. So let's think about market selection. The one thing that COVID-19 did do is it snapped into focus the fact that having all one's proverbial eggs in one basket really isn't a very wise decision. Now, it's not just COVID-19, of course, that really did snap things into focus. But the reality is there's an awful lot happening in the world of international trade. There always has been, but at the moment, of course, we're also looking at trade wars. We're looking at COVID-19 that has forced many markets to focus inward while they're supporting their own industries. And that means that imports have been curtailed in some of those markets. We're all conscious of the fact that there is a trade war waging between the United States and China. That seems to be a little bit off the boil at the moment. But of course, Australia has been facing its own issues with China. Having said that, though, there are all sorts of impacts as a result of COVID-19 in markets as diverse as the EU, for example, where there has been focus on that inward market. And it has been very much a case of everyone battening down the hatches and looking after their own before they look after anybody else. All that means is whatever it is that you were doing before COVID, you really should be rethinking your markets. Very important to remember that not all markets are created equal. When you choose new markets, when you're choosing to expand, you need to make calculated strategic decisions. Demographics, of course, play a part in that decision-making process, but there are so many other things that you need to take into account. And we're going to touch on some of those things this afternoon. Just a reminder before we seriously get going, if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box or the Q&A box. I will take those as we go through, or we'll save them for the end, depending on what the relevance of the question is to the particular subject that's being discussed. So when you're thinking about the market that you ideally would like to be involved in, at the very least, you need to think about the following things. Is there actually a demand for your product and or your service? It really doesn't matter how great your product is or how well priced it is or how your service is in a section of the market that nobody else is taking care of. If there is no demand in your chosen market, you don't have a market. You also need to ask yourself if you can afford to sell your product and service in that potential market. Again, it doesn't matter how great it is. If people in that market cannot afford to purchase what you're selling, clearly you can't be selling it there. Are you actually allowed to sell your product and your service in that market? So let's say, for example, you are a manufacturer of computer software, and that computer software has an application that can also be seen as a defense application. well, then there's every chance that you are not allowed to export it. And certainly most markets in the world would not allow you to sell it to them. They would not be allowed to import it. So you need to look at the regulation that governs your particular sector and understand whether you are in fact allowed to sell into another market. Assuming you can sell into that market, you have to think about how you sell into that market. Just exactly what do you need to do to service the market? You also need to ask, can you make it? So you might have a product that is perfectly suited to the Australian market, but you need to make certain adaptations to it for it to be accepted in an overseas market. Can you make those adaptations? And of course, you also need to consider success. So if you get a really large export order, are you able to service that order? Can you actually produce in sufficient quantities to service an overseas market? How are you going to get your product in the hands of your customer? That's vitally important. Until you've actually placed your product in the hands of your customer, you haven't actually sold it. And of course, you also need, very importantly, to think about how you are going to get paid. There are certain markets in which you are allowed to do business, but you cannot expatriate funds from those markets. So if your customer is paying you in that market, how are you going to get the money out? There are also markets that are just more difficult in which to get payment at all. So you need to take that into account when you decide that a market is the right one for you. And it all starts with doing your homework. And of course, doing your homework is really just doing market research. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you do proper market research before you take on any market. And to some extent, that also applies domestically. If you are servicing a particular market domestically and you choose to expand into a different market, same rules apply. You need to do your homework. But it's vitally important if you are going into an overseas market. Now, for those of you that are already exporting, anything you know about a market does not necessarily apply to a new market, which means you have to start again. And if you do the research upfront, if you take the time, make the effort, and possibly spend some money, it is going to save you a lot of heartache and certainly a great deal of money at the end of the day. So research will help you to choose the best market, not just the best market overall, but the best market for you and for your product. It will help you to determine the best product and service to offer in that market. And that might mean adapting what you do, coming up with new lines, etc., to service that market. It will also help you to establish appropriate and profitable pricing. Now, we're going to be talking quite a bit about pricing over the course of today and again in our following seminar. But just bear in mind that if your pricing is not appropriate to the market, you aren't going to sell it there. And if your pricing is not appropriate to your pricing strategy, you're not going to make any money. You also need to plan a marketing and a sales strategy that is specific to the market or markets that you have selected. If you understand your market by doing the research now, it will save you a world of pain later. So there are really two main areas of market research, and this is not rocket science, but sometimes we need to just stop for a moment and take stock of what it is that we actually know and remind ourselves of that fact. So first of all, secondary market research, and it might seem odd that the secondary one comes first, but the secondary one is the desk research. This is where you are going to literally sit at your desk and you are going to surf the net. You're going to look at any number of websites. You're going to look at what your competitors are doing. You're going to explore marketing channels. You're going to refresh your social media skills and your knowledge there. You're going to find out things like demographics. So how big is the market? How big is the market for your product? What is the expendable income in that market? Is it growing? Is it stagnant, etc.? What is the ease of doing business in that market? So just how easy is it to trade from overseas in that market? And there are any number of ways that you can determine that, and I'll give you some resources later on today. What is the market size? What are your competitors doing in that market? First of all, who are they? What are they selling? What price point are they selling at? How are they marketing their goods and services, etc.? What are the marketing channels that are acceptable in that market? And again, just because it works in Australia doesn't mean it's going to work anywhere else. And then secondly, there's the primary market research. Now, before COVID hit us and we were able to travel freely, this is where I would be telling you all about visiting the market. Well, now, of course, we can't do that. So you will be doing your primary research now from your office. And this involves direct contact with experts like Global Victoria. Remember, Global Victoria has a really well-established network of offices all over the world. And those offices will give you a wealth of information about what is happening on the ground in those markets. Similarly, so will Austrade. You will speak to your existing customers. You will speak to potential customers in your markets of choice. All of these people will give you inside information on market opportunities, market sentiment, the stuff that you can't really read about because no one is talking about it in public. People will have those conversations with you in private. Non-tariff barriers to entry, potential partners, potential customers, etc. Now, of course, you can't do it face to face, so you're almost certainly going to be doing it in the same sort of forum that we're doing it today. You're going to be doing it via Zoom, in one online form or another, or in fact, just picking up a telephone. Now, you see in front of you some useful resources. Just so that you know, these slides will also be made available to you after the fact, but you're more than welcome to take a screenshot of this, which should give you a really good sense of where we're going. So some useful researchers to help you with that desk research. The first one that you see there is the CIA World Factbook site. And yes, it is the Central Intelligence Agency, but they maintain a really detailed and very accurate set of data about every country in the world. The World Factbook really is quite phenomenal. So make a note of that one. The World Bank has any number of resources that you can download, reports, trade sentiment, the way that trade is moving, etc. Transparency International is where you go to get that all-important transparency index, ease of doing business, etc. The WTO, the World Trade Organization website, again, lots of reports, lots of market intelligence, lots of suggestions about what is happening in markets from a forecasting perspective. The World Customs Organization website is where you're going to go to get a lot of information around things like let's see, for example, the World Customs Organization keeps the whole list of HS codes, for example. So that's where you're going to go to check that your HS codes are up to date. The ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, is where you're going to get all the information you need on the most recent updates to Incoterms. Then the Australian government through DFAT has their FTA portal where you get a wealth of information on free trade agreements. The abf.gov.au site is where you're going to get your tariff classification and your tariff calculation guides. And then there are various others, including how to import Australia, where you will get lots of information about supply into Australia. And if you are buying components, for example, you are buying goods to sell overseas, that's where you're going to get that information. And then finally, the United Nations. Also lots and lots of interesting reports, data, etc., that you can download. Now, you've done your desk research, you've had your conversations with various people in market, you have a fair idea of the sort of market that you think you'd like to go into, and you think it might work. You need to be applying the 4 Ps. Now, everyone who's had any sort of training in marketing or any contact with marketing is conscious of the 4 Ps. The 4 Ps are also really useful tools to apply when finally doing your market selection. So just to recap, what are the 4 Ps? The 4 Ps are product, price, place, and promotion. So let's look at product. You already know what your product is. You know what it is that you make. But is what you make going to sell in the market that you think you've identified? So first of all, is there a need for your product in that market? Question number one. If there is, that's a really good place to start. If there isn't, well, then you probably need to look at a different market. What then do you need to do to that product to make it saleable in the market that you have selected? And when you make that decision, you need to consider the whole product package. It's about the product, absolutely. Size, shape, feel, etc. But it's also about the packaging of that product. What are the rules and regulations that govern packaging in a particular market? Same to your product. What is it that you have to do? Do you need to get it certified if it's an electrical good, for example? Do you need permission to sell it in a specific market? Where do you go to get that done? What are the labeling regulations? Just as if we import something into Australia, it has to comply with Australian labeling rules and regulations. So if you are exporting your good to any market in the world, you will have to comply with the labeling requirements in that market. And what applies in China is almost certainly not going to apply in Indonesia. So you need to understand what the vagaries are in that particular market. You also need to consider your brand reputation in that market. Do you have a reputation in that market? Is it a good one? Or is it a bad one? Is it something that might have happened that you weren't even aware of that has tarnished your reputation in a particular market? Has somebody been trading under your name in that market and they may have tarnished your reputation? You also need to understand what the reputation is of the state of Victoria in that market and the country of Australia in that market. If you are selling, for example, fresh produce, then Australia has a really good reputation in most markets, and that is a very big tick for you to enter that market. You also need to think what your competitors are doing. So have a look at the competition in that market. And bearing in mind that the competition is not just overseas competition, it is competition that is already established domestically in that market. Who are your competitors? What are they selling? How are they selling it? How are they labeling it, packaging it, merchandising it, etc.? You need to have a really clear picture of the competition if you are going to compete properly. The next thing you need to think about is price. Now, price is very, very important. You need to choose your market based on what you need to charge to make a reasonable profit. And of course, that means you need to know what that is. And you need to know that your chosen market can and will pay that price. Getting the price right is absolutely crucial to determining success in your chosen market. If you price too low, you won't make any money. And of course, you could also lose marketing advantage because if a product is pitched wrong and it's pitched too low for the particular market, it's not valued as much. Conversely, if you price too high, you might price yourself out of the market. So one of the things that is always raised, and slightly less these days, considering some of the issues that have been faced in the fresh produce market in certain parts of the world, but people often cite the example of, oh, I can get $40 for a mango in China. Well, the truth is you cannot. And if you think you can, and if that's why you've chosen that market, you are setting yourself up for failure. So be realistic about where you pitch, whether you're pitching for volume and therefore you're cutting your price, or if you're pitching in the premium sector of the market where you expect to sell less, but you are selling at a higher price. A well thought out pricing strategy is crucial for success. So of course you need to know your price and the cost that has determined that price. But it's also very important that you understand why you've chosen to price in a particular way and how that affects your position in the market. So it's not just that you price, it is why you price. It is the strategy behind it. And that strategy needs to be in place, not just for the short term, but for the longer term. Also, very important, once you've actually determined a pricing strategy, you need to stick to it. You can't be moving your price up and down all the time. You can't be changing your pricing model all the time. If you do that, you will lose customers because people will be frustrated and annoyed and they will move elsewhere. And of course, you will also lose market share. So we're going to focus just on 3 pricing models today. We're not going to go into them in a huge amount of detail. It's really just a case of being aware that these are the most recognized pricing modules that are commonly applied. Cost plus pricing, demand-based pricing, and marginal costing. So cost plus pricing is what most people use. It's a strategy which is also known as markup pricing, break-even pricing, or cost-based pricing. So essentially, you take your costs, you add a fixed percentage margin to the cost of that product, and you come up with your price. So cost plus margin gives you your price. Cost plus is one of the most basic and straightforward pricing strategies. Pros, it's easy. It's really easy to do. Cons, it all hinges on having your costs very accurately calculated. If you have forgotten something or you have miscalculated something, you're not going to make the margin that you thought you were, and your profit is not going to be as high as you thought it was. In fact, you might even lose money. Value-based pricing, which is also known as demand-based pricing, focuses on figuring out the maximum amount a customer is willing to pay for your product based on the demand for that product. Now, it can help you understand the demand for your product, of course, and you might be able to get a higher price than you thought. So your product, you might have thought, is a medium range product, but you go into the market and you discover that your customers are prepared to pay more, but you might have to introduce a new line to get that higher price. The con, of course, there is that your research needs to be really great. If you don't get your research absolutely spot on, you're going to miscalculate. And of course, also bear in mind that customers can be fickle. So just as the demand could be high today and therefore the price is high today, tomorrow somebody else enters the market and the demand for your product goes down and therefore you can't command that high price any longer. The third pricing model that I would just like to pause on is marginal costing. So marginal costing implies the additional cost involved in producing just one extra unit of output. Now, this can be reckoned by total variable cost assigned to that one unit. It takes into account all variable costs, but it effectively excludes fixed costs. So essentially, you determine the cost to make the product that you make, and that takes into account everything, including variable and fixed costs. And then you calculate what it would cost you to make one more of that unit, taking into account only the variable costs. So it excludes things like rent, warehousing, salaries, etc., all the fixed costs. The pro, it's useful to help you plan your profit. It's also helpful to determine profitability at different levels of production and sale. So if you sell 10 units, this is the price. If you sell 20, 30, etc. On the downside, it can result in a reduction of margins if your export business gains a higher than forecast proportion of your total business. So if you'd assume that you are going to produce X number of units more and you actually produce exponentially more than that, you will have miscalculated. It's also very important to note that if marginal pricing gets out of control, it's almost impossible to raise your prices to protect your margin in that case. So marginal costing is actually quite a risky model, and you might want to reconsider if that is what you're planning to do for your export pricing calculation. Now, just about every pricing model, irrespective of what you do, is dependent on your input cost. If you are exporting, particularly if you are relatively new to exporting, you have to take into account that export includes a whole world of costs over and above those that you would normally include in domestic sales and domestic pricing. So just some of the things that you need to take into account. Any product additions or modifications. So do you need to change the size, the shape, the volume in a particular package, for example? Do you need to change colors? Do you need to retool to do something specific? So what do you have to do to that product? What do you have to add to it? How do you need to modify it to sell it in your chosen market? Any special packaging, any changes in ingredients that you have to put in. So let's say, for example, you are producing a food product, and one of the elements of that food product has some type of pork in it. It might be a really minor component in your food product. So let's say you're making ice cream mix, for example, and part of the ice cream mix, in addition to dairy, you put in a bit of pork fat for stabilization. If you are looking at Indonesia as a market, you cannot sell any pork item into that market. Therefore, you have to change the formulation of your ice cream mix. That could cost considerable amounts of money and re-engineering of your product, because it is not going to be as stable as it was before. So think about that and how much it's going to cost you. Also, specification modifications. So to comply with local regulations and certification, what do you need to do to your product? Think about additional quality control. It's relatively easy for you to do quality control if all your product is onshore and you can take something back if it hasn't worked. Quality control needs to be a whole other level if you are shipping products offshore and it's not quite so simple to return them. Export administration costs a lot of money. You need to amortize that over the cost of your unit. Freight, of course, you physically have to get your goods into somebody's hands. How much is that going to cost you? Distribution costs, how much? How do you amortize that? Additional marketing, particularly in channels that you might not be familiar with. Insurance costs. You have to insure your goods if you're selling them offshore, but it's more than just insuring your goods. You might also need trade credit insurance. So all the insurance that you need to include, how much is that going to cost you? Foreign exchange risk. If you're selling offshore and you are accepting payments in a foreign currency, you have to take into account currency fluctuations that could cost you at the end of the day. And then there are export documentation and procedural costs as well. So customs clearance, literally issuing of documentation, port clearances, etc. All of that stuff costs money, and you need to take it into account in your costing exercise. The next P that we're going to focus on is place. So these are all the things that you need to consider before choosing the place to which to export. Everything, of course, that your market research has already told you, but also any regulations that may stop you exporting or indeed your customer importing your goods. So you need to have a really clear idea of the regulations in your chosen market. You need to understand if there's a free trade agreement in place. If there is, it's almost certainly a really good thing for you, because it means that you can get preferential tariffs for your goods, or in some cases, no tariffs at all. So is there an FTA in place? What does it mean? If there is an FTA and you want to make use of it, what are the rules of origin that determine that your goods arise in Australia? And how do you go about proving that they do? And how do you get your certificates of origin? Any duties and tariffs that apply to your product, you need to understand what those are, because if you don't know, you do not know what in truth your customer is paying for your product. And having a really high duty or tariff applying to your product might mean that you are priced out of a particular market. If there is a free trade agreement in place, those tariffs and duties don't necessarily come off immediately. They might tear down over a period of time. So if you look at a market, today it might not be viable for you, but it could be viable for you in 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 years. You might want to think about that. Any potential non-tariff barriers to entry. So what is it that could stop you successfully doing business in a market that has nothing to do with duties and tariffs that are added onto your product? So basic things like it might be really difficult to get your goods and products through customs in a particular market. Not a written rule, just something which occurs. And that's the sort of information that you will get from doing that primary research when you've actually spoken to people on the ground. You need to know if you can protect your intellectual property. If you can't protect your IP in a market, you might want to think really long and hard about whether you are going to enter that market. And if you do, you need to understand that you're going to have to change your products all the time because what you were selling initially could be ripped off. So that means you need to stay ahead of the curve if you cannot protect your IP in that market. Any logistic issues you face getting your product to the market, some places are very difficult to export to, and that is particularly important to take into account now. COVID-19 has meant that the number of international flights into and certainly out of Australia have reduced dramatically. And that means the amount of belly space that is available for you to put goods on an aeroplane has just reduced dramatically too. Shipping to certain markets could be very difficult, particularly if you are moving from one market to another. There might not be direct shipping lines between those markets. If you think of the sort of issue that occurred just recently in the Suez Canal, when a ship literally blocked the canal and nothing could get through, what happened logistically for all the people that were sitting trying to get goods on ships from one end of the canal to the other? And then, of course, you also need to consider if you will get paid in a particular market and how you will get paid in that market. That could also be as simple as determining how it is that you're going to invoice in that market. Some markets might simply not ever do cash up front. They will only ever work on terms. Is that something you really want to do? So think about that. The final P is promotion. And this might seem like a no-brainer as well. But the key around promotion is that what works in Australia almost certainly won't work in your target market. So before you determine that a market is right for you and your product, you need to understand the regulations that govern promotion and advertising. If you have been absolutely dependent on a certain mode of advertising and promotion for your product, and that mode of advertising and promotion is forbidden in the market that you think would be perfect for you, how are you going to tell your potential customers about this product? So you have to take that into account. You also need to look at the accepted promotion and marketing channels in a particular market. So let's say, for example, you want to export to China. And in Australia, you have had very successful campaigns running on Facebook. You're not going to do that in China. Facebook doesn't work there. So you have to think about other markets and other marketing channels, and therefore, can you still sell in that market? You need to think about what it costs. Promotion and marketing costs vary dramatically from one country to another. Your chosen market, you might find, is so expensive for you to promote your goods and your services that it's just not viable for you to go in there. And of course, you need to understand what the competition is doing. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do what the competition does, but it means you need to be aware of what they are doing. And maybe going in and doing something completely different is how you will win market share. But you need to understand what is acceptable in that market, because that is what your competition is already doing. Before you decide to choose a market, once you have played the promotional piece, you need to acknowledge your expertise, but you also need to acknowledge your limitations. Now, once you've applied those 4 Ps and you've decided that you have pretty much agreed that you can go into a particular market, you need to think about how it is you enter that market, which means you need to determine a market entry model. And again, the market entry model that you choose might curtail your ability to actually go into a certain market. You need to think about how you're going to access that market and how you are allowed to access that market. Regulation in certain markets will predetermine your market entry strategy, and that predetermination may make that market untenable for you. So market entry models include direct sales, and that includes e-commerce. So that means you sell directly to an end customer. And that is both B2B and B2C. You ship it from here to a customer in another market. They pay you, and that's the end of the transaction. Appointing a distributor. Now, in certain markets, you cannot sell directly. You have to appoint a distributor. What is a distributor? How does a distribution agreement look? What is it that you need to take into account when it comes to distribution? Bear in mind that a distributor is really a customer. Your distributor buys from you and then resells, and there's a whole world that you need to think about when that occurs. Appointing an agent. Perhaps your choice is not to go with a distributor, but to go with an agent. You need to understand that an agent never buys from you. An agent is just a conduit to your goods into a particular market. And that means that just because you've appointed an agent doesn't mean you've sold a single bean. You also need to understand that in some markets, agents are seen as employees, and you have all the benefits that accrue to those employees along with that. So the next thing that you need to think about is partnerships. Are you going to enter into a partnership agreement in a particular market? And are you allowed to? If you do, what does that partnership need to look like? Who has to hold the majority share? The same thing applies to JVs. Joint ventures are great ways of entering markets. They can also be very fraught. What does the regulation say in that market about who holds the majority share? Do you need to have local directors, for example? And do they have to be people in a certain class of director? Licensing. Are you just going to license your goods? And if so, for how much? Under what terms are you going to do that? And the same applies to setting up a franchise operation. And then finally, this is the mother lode of all, you decide to set up an actual operation in another market. So you're not based in Australia and you're just trading on the other side of the globe. You are physically establishing a presence there. And that, of course, has a whole raft of regulations, requirements, etc., that you need to take into account. Through all of the market entry stuff, I also want to emphasize the fact that it's probably going to take longer than you thought. I'm always saying to people that think about a time frame, double that, and think about how much money you're going to make when you go into a new market, and halve that, and you might be almost on your way. Now, just before we close today, I just want to pause on e-commerce. Cross-border e-commerce, i.e. exporting online, is still exporting. All the same considerations, the same challenges, the same obligations apply when it comes to selecting your export markets. So when you are deciding that, particularly if you haven't exported yet, and you're looking at e-commerce as your first port of call, as many companies do, at the very least, you need to consider ease of entry. Can you actually sell into a particular market? And how easy is it, even if you are doing it B2C through e-commerce? What is your sales model going to be? Are you going to sell through your own website with everything that goes with that, including payment gateways, shopping carts, etc.? Or are you going to sell through an online platform like Amazon, for example, or eBay, or any one of the others? You need to understand what those models are and why you choose the one you do, and all the implications of that choice. You still need to know what the demand is for your product. And remember, when you are selling in that B2C space, the demand for your product is just reduced by the magnitude of others who are selling B2B and B2C in the same space. Think about logistics. How are you going to get your product into that market? And how quickly can you do it? What are the marketing requirements? And if you're using a platform, those marketing requirements are not necessarily directly in your hands. And again, you need to consider what the competition is doing.